plan also calls for the monitoring of force withdrawal, but it makes no mention of whether those forces are just the Iraqis or whether the withdrawal of coalition forces would also be monitored under this agreement. Those are a few of the points to be discussed now with Sergei Grigoriev, assistant to the chief spokesman for President Gorbachev. And if I may, Mr. Grigoriev, you also hold a couple of other roles. You are, I gather, one of President Gorbachev's chief interpreters.
Sometimes, yes.
You were the interpreter tonight when he spoke with President Bush?
Yes, I was.
All right. With that as background, perhaps we can begin then to clarify not only some of the points I've raised, but also you and I were chatting briefly just before the program, and there was something that apparently I misunderstood. I was under the impression that this was an agreement which had already been agreed to by the Iraqis. You say that generally speaking that's true, but there is still some more work to be done. Is that correct?
Well, I would say that basically the agreement is reached. I mean, the whole plan has been agreed, and Mr. Aziz went as far as agreeing to release the whole agreement, the whole text, to Soviet and foreign journalists at the Soviet Foreign Ministry Press Center. And I think that this will involve some clarification also between Mr. Aziz and Mr. Hussein in terms of, first of all, terms and some of the conditions. But we can see that basically this is the package that Mr. Aziz came back to Moscow from Baghdad, and we can see that this illustrates real willingness of Iraq to negotiate and to cooperate.
But just to be absolutely precise on that point, he, that is Aziz, still has to take this plan back to Saddam Hussein for final approval?
No, he's not taking this plan for final approval. He'll be just put through direct line to Mr. Saddam Hussein, and they'll just finalize certain details. As I said, all the points given by Mr. Ignatyenko at the briefing are absolutely reflecting both positions, and there's a coincidence between these positions. Certain minor details have to be finalized.
All right, let's talk now about some of the ambiguities that still remain in the agreement. For example, there is no mention in this agreement of Iraq's willingness to recognize the sovereignty of Kuwait. There is no mention in this agreement of Iraq's willingness to see a restoration of the previous legitimate government of Kuwait. What does that mean?
Well, this was discussed, and I can assure you that this agreement involves this. And it is really meant that it is the unconditional withdrawal of all Iraqi troops from Kuwait. It is the restoration of Kuwait's independence and sovereignty, and it is the recognition of the fact that only the legitimate government of Kuwait can come back and be the ruler in their own country.
If it recognizes all of that, why doesn't it say so?
I think it goes without saying, because point number one in this agreement recognizes that Iraq should withdraw unconditionally, and the unconditional withdrawal, as it is foreseen in the United Nations Security Council resolution, means that it's withdrawing.
No, I understand that it means withdrawal, although there are even some ambiguities on that point, but since for the last 7 months we have been listening to Saddam Hussein refer to Kuwait as province number 19, since he has repeatedly said that Iraq will never give up its claim to Kuwait, don't you think that that's just a minor oversight not to have that mentioned in there, that he now recognizes the sovereignty and the legitimacy of the government?
I think this agreement involves it, and it's definitely involved, and it was discussed by both sides. It goes without saying now here. When they withdraw, they leave Kuwait to Kuwaitis, and it's going to be independent and sovereign state of Kuwait. May I also attract your attention to the point that already last week the radio of Baghdad was speaking twice of Kuwait as of Kuwait, not calling it the 19th province of Iraq, which is an important shift in their position.
Well, it is a very subtle reference, you're right. It is a significant shift in their position, but given all the bloodshed that has taken place up until now, one would think that this would be something that would be spelled out. But I don't want to belabor that point. Quite clearly, there are others who will have to come to terms with it. Let's go to the first point that you raised, namely the unconditionality of the withdrawal of Iraqi forces from Kuwait. You are an absolute master of the English language, so I don't have to belabor this point either. No conditions means no conditions, and yet the withdrawal is not unconditional. There is a two-thirds withdrawal, and then quite clearly there is a condition that is placed upon the withdrawal of the remaining third of Iraqi forces.
Well, as I understand, you're asking about the point that means that when two-thirds of the Iraqi troops are being pulled out of Kuwait, some of the sanctions foreseen by the UN Security Council resolution will be lifted. It is true, but not all of the sanctions.
No, I understand, but if we're talking about unconditional, unconditional means there are no conditions, and whether it's one of the other UN Security Council resolutions or half a dozen of them, if the condition is that after Iraq has withdrawn two-thirds of its forces, it will then only remove the remaining one-third, which after all is about 170,000 troops, that's a condition, isn't it?
Well, I wouldn't call it a condition exactly in the formal understanding of it. But I think we are trying to put aside the mere fact that we are talking about negotiations with Iraq. We're not just imposing something on Iraq. We're trying to avoid a real major war in the history of humanity. And if we're trying to avoid a war, we have to take certain things into account, like the fact that probably we should give Iraq a chance to save face. Just for example, because if we want the negotiations to continue, and if we see that Iraqis are withdrawing, why don't we accelerate it not by force, but by some of the peaceful levers, but just saying that the international community is encouraging them to go. I mean, you guys go and probably some of the sanctions will be lifted. I don't see anything wrong with this position.
All right, Mr. Grigoriev, we're going to take a short break, and we'll come back and have some more on that point and then some of the other ambiguous points. Okay. We'll continue our conversation in just a minute with Soviet spokesman Sergei Grigoriev, who is also one of President Gorbachev's principal interpreters and was the man who interpreted for President Gorbachev in his conversation earlier this evening with President Bush. I realize that confidentiality will not allow you to go into details, but can you characterize sort of the mood or the tone of those conversations?
Well, I would say that, first of all, it was a very friendly conversation. And it's a real pleasure to see that the level of understanding between the two world leaders is very high, as well as the level of personal support. Of course, there are certain differences and different approaches, but at the same time, I think that both leaders act in the spirit of respect for each other, respect for their activities. And at the same time, both sides also recognize that whatever was done to contain the Iraqi aggression was done in the process of consultations and cooperation between the two countries. And in particular between the leaders of the two countries.
If I may, I'd just like to point out to our affiliated stations down the line, since this is an extraordinary opportunity to speak to someone who has perhaps unique insights as to the nature of the Soviet proposal. We're going to be running a little bit over, and we'll be hearing from Congressman Les Aspin a little bit later in this broadcast. But Mr. Grigoriev, you referred before the commercial break, and you may have done so only casually, but you referred to negotiations. Is it your impression that a negotiating process is now underway, one in which the United States is participating?
I wouldn't call it a negotiating process when the United States is participating. I would put it differently. I would say it's a negotiating process between the whole world and the aggressor, between the whole world and Iraq. And it's just a good chance for the international community that Soviet president can play a role of a peacemaker in this process.
But when
because it's not a problem between President Bush and Saddam Hussein. It's the problem between Saddam Hussein and the rest of the world, which condemned his aggression against Kuwait.
But nevertheless,
there's no question about it.
But nevertheless, you say there is a negotiating process, and I think you would concede that the United States is certainly a key partner in what goes on here.
If I can elaborate here, I'll put it like this. There is a negotiating process between the Soviet Union acting on behalf of the international community and Iraq. And at the same time, there is a process of consultations between other members of the anti-Iraqi coalition, between those who are represented by the armed forces in the Gulf and who are not. But yet, all of them voted for the UN Security Council resolution calling withdrawal, calling for withdrawal.
I don't intend this as a disrespectful question, but who appointed the Soviet Union to negotiate in anyone's behalf?
We are not saying that someone has to be appointed. It comes to a point when someone who has a chance should show an initiative like this. And I think it's the political boldness of President Gorbachev that he took upon himself the burden of negotiating with the Iraqis. And I think that it should be made clear that it's done so not only in the interests of the Soviet Union, and it's done in the interest of prevention of a major war that can break any time, because it can have most unpredictable consequences and implications, and it may cause not only losses of thousands and dozens of thousands of human lives, each of which is a precious thing, but also of different ecological and other kind of implications.
One more question on this negotiating process, and then back to the proposal itself. You said that President Gorbachev is negotiating with the Iraqis. Is President Gorbachev also negotiating with President Bush or with the coalition?
I'm saying that President Gorbachev is not negotiating with President Bush. Both presidents, President Bush and President Gorbachev, are in consultations about their activities vis-a-vis the behavior of Iraq, which is obviously changing.
Okay. Back now to that, the first point, the old resolution, 660, which is sort of the key Security Council resolution, calls for, as you may recall, not only the immediate and complete and unconditional withdrawal of Iraqi troops, but also makes reference to them withdrawing to positions that they held prior to August 1st of last year. That is important, as I'm sure you understand, because as of August 1st of last year, there were perhaps 3 Iraqi divisions in the region, that is close to the Kuwaiti border or inside Kuwait. Now there are 30 Iraqi divisions either inside Kuwait or along the border. Why is there no reference to the withdrawal of all of those troops, who represent 500,000 men, back to the positions they held on August 1st?
Well, I believe this all is negotiable, and these things can be divided into different stages. The most important thing for us is to make sure that we prevent this war, and we make sure that Iraqis get out of Kuwait. After all, there definitely has to be a plan for peaceful settlement for the Gulf. And I think there has to be set up a kind of a security structure which will see to it that not only all the UN Security Council resolutions will be put into life, but that can see to it that Iraq will be disarmed and put in a situation when it will not be able any longer arm itself using the dividends it gets from oil and other resources. There has to be a structure when other countries in the Gulf, as well as in the Middle East and elsewhere, should feel safe. And this is very important. But the important thing is to start negotiating now to make sure that we can prevent this war. And if we convince the Iraqis to go, it means that they can yield to this pressure and that they see how they are condemned by the international community. And if they make this first step, nothing stops us from making another step, delivering more pressure on them, making them occupy the positions they occupied before August 1st, and then gradually disarming.
But Mr. Grigoriev, it seems to me that we are drifting a long, long way from that fundamental, rather easy to understand UN Security Council resolution, which calls for the total, unconditional, immediate withdrawal. And now we are talking about a negotiating process, or you are talking about a negotiating process, that presumably would take place in several phases over an extended period of time. That's a long way from what the UN Security Council called for.
I agree with you on one hand, Mr. Coppola. On the other hand, let me say the main demand of the UN Security Council coalition is to make sure that the Iraqis get out of Kuwait as soon as possible and unconditionally, and that Kuwaitis have their own independent sovereign country. As long as this is reached, we think that probably it's worth negotiating for a long time than waste any human lives. And in this war, suffering will be not only the Iraqi side, the Iraqi soldiers, Iraqi innocent children, women, senior citizens, but there will be also a lot of human lives wasted on behalf of the coalition. So what is more precious to us? What are our values? what do we care more for? Delay in terms of eventual and gradual disarmament of Iraq, or we care more about some lives wasted, which is all kind of a tragedy, and it's bloodshed, and not to mention all the economic and ecological consequences for the region. What is more valuable?
You make some very compelling points, Mr. Grigoriev, and I'm simply trying to compare the Soviet peace proposal to what was agreed to, after all, by the world community at the United Nations and in the Security Council, to be specific. For example, there is another point. One of the resolutions calls for or reminds Iraq that it will be liable for reparations to Kuwait for all the damage that it has done. The Soviet peace proposal is silent on that point. Why?
The Soviet peace proposal does not mention this, but this does not mean that the Soviet Union is not supporting the idea of reparations. I think this also can be worked out at a second stage, when we reach the most important thing now, when we prevent the ground war and when we make sure that the Iraqis are out of Kuwait. As soon as we reach this, we can continue using all kind of levers we have to make sure that the UN Security Council resolution is put into life from very beginning to the end.
Let me
taking
just
everything into account.
Forgive me for interrupting. I just wanted to warn our viewers there is a possibility we may lose our satellite link to Moscow. I think we are scheduled to lose it at midnight. I just want to ask you one more quick question, Mr. Grigoriev,
okay,
and that has to do with the monitoring of the withdrawal of forces. Now, it may just have been an oversight. I'm sure everyone was in a great hurry to get this proposal out. But the forces are not referred to by name. It does not speak of Iraqi forces, it speaks of forces, and that there will be monitoring by people who have played no role on either side in the Gulf War. In theory, the Iraqis could come some weeks from now and say, all right, what about the monitoring now of the withdrawal of American and Egyptian and British troops from the region? Was that intended?
I don't think so. I think what is really intended is to set up a panel of observers appointed by the United Nations to make sure that the withdrawal is monitored.
Which
the withdrawal of Iraqis from Kuwait.
What about the
I don't think that it is the very fact, the mere fact that the war will be prevented, if it will be prevented, and that the Allied troops will be where they stay now, does not think that this point is directed in any way against them. I think there will be just no point in having so much troops there, and after that, this is all negotiable.
There is one point that Saddam Hussein made again and again and again from August 12th on, and that was the need for linkage between a peace proposal or a peace plan and a Middle East peace conference of some kind that in particular would take up the Palestinian issue. Now, I'm sure that Tariq Aziz did not forget that or overlook it, so can you tell me that this was left out with Iraqi understanding and compliance?
I can understand that this was dropped out completely, and the Iraqis are no longer raising this question. It was made very clear to Mr. Aziz that we're not raising this question, and no one is raising this question in connection with other issues. There might be time and need to discuss other problems that the world is facing. There's so many of them. But we're talking now about Iraqi withdrawal from Kuwait, and that's the basic thing, about prevention of a major war. If we can do it, if this can be achieved, let's say today, within one day, then it will be great. Then it will be a big victory for all of us.
Can you also assure us, Mr. Grigoriev, that there are no unwritten, secret Soviet assurances to the Iraqis, for example, on a point such as that, saying, yes, at the appropriate time, we give you our silent word that the Soviet Union will raise the issue of a peace conference in the Palestinian question. Are there any unspoken agreements here?
Not that I know about, and I doubt it very much. Basically, what President Gorbachev told today President Bush is the whole contents of the talks he was having with Mr. Aziz. And I don't think that there is anything under it or behind it.
Mr. Grigoriev, it was very gracious of you to get up so early and to come into our Moscow bureau.
Well,
Thank you for being with us.
I just didn't sleep. wasn't wake-up.
Okay.
There's a big difference.
I understand. Thank you very much. I appreciate it all the more.
It's a pleasure, Mr. Coppola. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. When we come back, we'll get a congressional view of the peace plan from the chairman of the House Armed Services Committee, Les Aspin. Washington Bureau is Congressman Les Aspin of Wisconsin, who serves as chairman of the House Armed Services Committee, which oversees the budget for the U.S. military. There was a lot there. What'd you think?
Well, I thought that the best news of it is that that they dropped the linkage to a Middle East peace conference. For the rest of it, I think it's an awful lot of problems.
Start spelling them out. I mean, some of those problems seemed implicit, but
yeah, let me start. The first thing is the reference in the agreement to dropping all of the UN resolutions once he's pulled out of Kuwait means that that you still have an awful lot of problems with that the Iraqi government has not accepted Kuwait, has not accepted the legitimate government of Kuwait. When you're dropping the UN resolutions, you're dropping that UN resolution that made null and void Iraq's annexation of Kuwait. You're dropping, besides the ability to force Iraq to accept Kuwait, you're dropping our ability to influence the government of Iraq after this crisis, because we're dropping the reparations, we're dropping the sanctions. Two-thirds of the way through the withdrawal, we then stopped the economic sanctions.
Well, you heard what Mr. Grigoriev said. I mean, I'm obviously translating very loosely here, but it was sort of picky. We'll take care of those things later on.
Yeah, I think that's the problem. How do you take care of those things later on once you have a ceasefire and once this thing is going? It seems to me that the basic core premise of the Soviet proposal is what's wrong here. The basic core premise is that somehow we want to avoid the war. Well, the war is already going on. What they mean is the ground war, that somehow the ground war is going to be horrible. Basically, my view is that this war is about won. It's about 90% won. And to come in now with this kind of a proposal, what you're doing is saving Saddam Hussein at the last minute. He doesn't deserve to be saved. He's got no negotiating leverage left. He's at the end of his rope. I think that these terms are just, in effect, as he admits, he's trying to save Saddam Hussein's face. The problem is that you save Saddam Hussein's face, you're going to face Saddam Hussein again 2 to 5 years from now when he goes back and is able to rebuild his situation. He's going to be a hero in the Arab world, and we'll face it all again.
Did you feel as queasy about the Soviet agreement when you first heard the agreement, or was it just hearing Mr. Grigoriev's interpretation?
Much more from Mr. Grigoriev's interpretation. Although clearly the outline of the agreement, it was pretty clear from the outline of the agreement that we have not, in that agreement, forced Iraq or Saddam Hussein to face up to the existence, the legitimacy of Kuwait, and we, number two, will have removed all of our ability to influence the nature of the government of Iraq after this crisis when you give away on reparations and give away on sanctions.
Do you think the president is now, in effect, and I don't want to use a loaded word here, but trapped into a negotiating process that he might have preferred to avoid?
I think that's a real danger. And I think that at this point, I think the president's in a very bad position, because what we're having here is clearly a negotiation going on. The Soviets say they're negotiating on behalf of the alliance, but clearly they are not.
No, they don't. No, they don't say that. They don't say they're negotiating on behalf of the... Well, yeah, maybe you're right. They're negotiating on behalf of the alliance, but not negotiating with the alliance.
That's exactly right. He claimed he was negotiating on behalf of the alliance, but they are not talking about their positions before they present them to Iraq with the alliance. In other words, he went into that, he meaning Gorbachev, went into this negotiation with Tariq Aziz and with Saddam Hussein with an agenda, a program which he presented and which he worked out then with Iraq without talking about it with the allies ahead of time. So in a sense, then he talks to the United States and says, this is what I presented and this is what we've agreed to. I mean, that's not really negotiating on behalf of the alliance in a fair manner. I think we've got to get ourselves out of the position here where the Soviets are negotiating on behalf of the alliance.
And how do we do that without the United States negotiating itself directly with Iraq?
I think that what we ought to do at this point, what the United States ought to do, is talk to the alliance partners, and we ought to make a take-it-or-leave-it deal to Saddam Hussein, saying there's a lot of progress that's been going on lately. We welcome that progress, the pledge to withdraw, the delinkage of anything in the Middle East. But here's the deal. The deal is, number one, total, complete, unconditional withdrawal from Kuwait. Number two, total acceptance of all of the UN resolutions. Number three, an exchange of prisoners of war. That's the deal. Take it or leave it, 24 hours, 48 hours, that's what you've got to decide.
But as things stand tonight, Congressman, and then I'm going to let you go, you think we're a little bit closer to peace tonight?
It's hard to say. I think we're a little bit in a box in the sense that we can't start the ground war at this point. But on the other hand, I don't think we're near to ending this standoff here with that kind of a proposal that the Soviets have. That's why I think what we really need to do at this point is get a United States-led proposal on behalf of the alliance, take it or leave it, building on what the Soviets are doing, saying that, look, the Soviets have made some progress here. We recognize the progress. We recognize they're trying. We recognize the good work they've done. But rather than us objecting and then the Soviets going back and negotiating again and then coming back and then maybe we object again, rather than that, let's give them a take-it-or-leave-it proposition. And I say a take-it-or-leave-it proposition because I basically think the alliance now is in an extraordinarily strong negotiating position. We can offer a proposal close to what the Soviets have, but dealing with all of the loose ends that you raised with tonight on the show, dealing with all of those loose ends, take-it-or-leave-it proposition and give them a timetable to say yes or no to.
All right, Mr. Chairman, thank you very much for joining us and for staying so late.
Thank you.
That's our report for tonight. I'm Ted Koppel in Washington. For all of us here at ABC News, good night.
From ABC News, this is a Gulf War update.
I'm Gary Shepard in Los Angeles. President Bush conferred with his top national security advisors at the White House tonight to discuss Iraq's offer of an unconditional withdrawal from Kuwait. When the meeting was over, a senior administration official said the proposal, part of a Soviet peace plan, is really a conditional withdrawal and is unacceptable to the United States. The administration is now consulting with America's allies.
America's watching ABC.
This is KPIX Eyewitness News at noon.
Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. I'm Liz Gonzalez. A new deadline for Iraq. President Bush has given Saddam Hussein until noon tomorrow to start pulling his forces out of Kuwait. If they stay put, the order to move over 500,000 ground troops to force them out could come within hours.
The coalition will give Saddam Hussein until noon Saturday to do what he must do. Begin his immediate and unconditional withdrawal from Kuwait. We must hear publicly and authoritatively his acceptance of these terms. The statement to be released, as you will see, does just this and informs Saddam Hussein that he risks subjecting the Iraqi people to further hardship unless the Iraqi government complies fully with the terms of the statement.
White House spokesperson Marlin Fitzwater released details of the plan just a few hours after President Bush spoke. Number one, Iraq has less than 24 hours to start pulling out of Kuwait. They must begin withdrawing their troops by noon tomorrow. All forces must be out of Kuwait City within 48 hours. The legitimate Kuwaiti government must be allowed to return to power. The withdrawal of Iraqi troops must be complete within a week. Saddam Hussein will have 2 days to turn over all prisoners of war, and they have to remove all explosives and booby traps in the area. President Bush and Secretary of State Jim Baker spoke with Soviet President Gorbachev for an hour and 15 minutes today going over the latest proposal for peace. Spokesperson Marlin Fitzwater described the conversation as thorough.
I think it's clear by the length of their conversation that they had a very good discussion of all of the major points. President Gorbachev, of course, spoke of the conversations that he has been having with Tariq Aziz. President Bush is very appreciative for the efforts that he has made, and together they discussed some of the avenues that we might take to ensure that we get a good withdrawal.
Again, publicly, the president said he appreciated President Gorbachev's efforts to try to end the war, but that the Soviet peace plan came with too many strings attached. So the Soviets continue to meet with Iraqi diplomats on a revised peace plan. Less than an hour ago, Soviet spokesperson Vitaly Ignatenko announced a new 6-point peace provision. It calls for withdrawal from Kuwait 1 day after a ceasefire, but it gives the Iraqis 21 days to complete it. In exchange, demands to drop economic sanctions before a complete withdrawal were left out.
And the regime and the leadership of Iraq did try, of course, to achieve some easing up of the conditions. These attempts have been rejected, and today you have a strict, forward-looking and a constructive document.
The latest plan has to be sent to Baghdad, and Moscow is waiting for a final response. As President Bush was giving Iraq an ultimatum to avoid a ground war, Baghdad radio was claiming that it had already begun. Broadcast reports said that Iraqi forces had repelled an attack led by a British armored division. The U.S. command immediately denied the claim. In Baghdad today, Friday morning prayers, the faithful stealing a few minutes away from the ravages outside the doors of the mosque. People scour the morning newspapers today looking for news of the Soviet peace plan. It was one of the few moments without air raid sirens going off this morning. Earlier, Allied warplanes had pounded the capital for more than 4 hours. And there's been no let-up in the air campaign and some stepped-up activity on the ground. U.S. and British forces mounted their heaviest artillery attacks of the war. The military calls it aggressive patrolling of the border. The experts say it's a prelude to an all-out ground offensive. Allied troops targeted Iraqi positions along the Kuwaiti border with a non-stop barrage. Central Command said that over 300 rockets were fired. Saddam Hussein has shown his willingness to use unconventional methods in the Persian Gulf War. Well, today the Allies say he has come up with another one, a scorched earth policy in Kuwait. U.S. Central Command says that Iraq is setting oil fields on fire all over the occupied country.
I just received intelligence at U.S. Central Command have indicated that well over 140 wells have been destroyed in the last 24 hours and are burning. About 25% of the Kuwaiti oil fields are covered by black smoke. Other facilities are being systematically destroyed.
General Neal said that U.S. forces would find a way to work around the fires and the smoke. He said the troops are ready for the ground war and they are just waiting for the order from the commander-in-chief. If Iraq does pull out of Kuwait, one big question is, will they take all of their military might with them? The Allies, of course, want them left behind. Today, Mike Hegedus looks at the Iraqi arsenal and where it stands today.
When Iraq invaded Kuwait in August, Saddam Hussein did so leading the 4th largest army in the world. He had 5,000 tanks, 2,200 personnel carriers, 2,200 artillery pieces, 689 combat aircraft, and 400,000 of his million-man army ended up in Kuwait. Now, over a month into the Gulf conflict, Allied commanders have achieved in large measure what they set out to do militarily, strip his war machine to its chassis in preparation for a ground war. So far, best estimates put Iraq's current troop strength at a little over 300,000 in Kuwait. With a third of his artillery reportedly destroyed, the number is about 1,500. And with airstrikes knocking out as many as 100 tanks a day over the last week, Allies guess his tank count could be down to 2,500 in the Kuwaiti theater, just about where they wanted him at the start of the ground war.
But not at the end of it. Or if he agreed to withdraw, they were counting on a timetable that would have forced him to leave his remaining tanks and artillery behind in Kuwait, in effect dismantling the Iraqi army. Now if he's allowed to withdraw and take that hardware with him back to Iraq, he's not the force he was at the beginning, but he is still a force.
So, Allied attacks continue, still aimed at preparing the battlefield, but also aimed at doing as much damage as possible as quickly as possible. Every weapon destroyed is one more that can't be taken back to Iraq. Mike Hegedus, Channel 5, Eyewitness News.
Focus on Channel 7 television and on KGO Radio AM 810. We've got, unfortunately, a little bit of time left. We're going to talk about what Richard Forgotten and brought us back to, winners and losers, and also what's going to happen after this war is over, whether it's, you know, a terrible casualty type of war or not. Khalil.
If I may go back just briefly to the point, very briefly, I think that Saddam Hussein is almost a legend in the Arab world right now, and to the characterization that he's a thug, he might be a thug, but after all, he's the United States thug.
He's a thug to us, he's Saladin to the Arab world.
That's one, but then again, I mean, many Arabs would argue that, and we never liked the guy, but you liked him. I mean, the Americans were supporting him throughout 8 years of war against Iran, and now that he lost his usefulness to the West, he turns out to be a thug also, just like Noriega.
Ultimately, who wins and who loses when this is all over?
I think that the ultimate winners will be both Iran and Israel.
Bill Press, what about
Richard,
you, winners and losers?
Well, I tell you, it depends on what we do after the war, to get to your other point.
You got 15 seconds.
Okay, I think we ought to do two things. If we don't ban international arms sales and stop selling arms to every thug in the world, and if we don't force the Israelis and the Palestinians to sit down and talk peace, we're going to continue to be fighting wars like this in the Middle East.
All right, Bill,
forever.
got to give the people poll here. It's 33% on the question, continue to negotiate, and 67% begin the ground war. If Iraq doesn't go along with Bush's ultimatum, what action should we take? Again, that's 33%, continue to negotiate, 67% the war. We're wrapping up here fast.
That's tonight's Focus. Thanks to all our guests. We'll see you next week.
Good night.
Good night.
We are hearing the same rumors. It hasn't happened yet. We're standing by at the radio all night to see if anything will come from the Revolution Command Council or from President Saddam Hussein. So far, we've heard nothing at all.
Now, there was some evidence that Saddam Hussein had met in the last 24 hours with the Revolutionary Command Council. Are those Iraqis in Baghdad aware that he, in the person of Tariq Aziz, has accepted the Soviet proposal or the Soviet-Iraqi plan for getting out of Iraq?
I believe that's been reported on the radio a number of times during the day. Wandering around the town, we get the impression that everybody knows there was something in the works and that it hasn't worked out. I don't think everybody in Baghdad knows the details. They're just trying to figure out how they're going to get through the first night of life with a ground war going on.
No, I know you were just trying to figure out what's going on at the window. Something, yes or no?
We saw flashes out the window.
Okay.
Whether we're going to be able to get pictures of them to you right now, we're not sure
Okay,
yet,
we won't
but,
distract you. Bill, there have been reports coming out of Iraq, quite often in the last little while, from people who've managed to get out of the country, that there is now a burgeoning opposition to President Saddam Hussein, that there are people who are no longer afraid to speak out against him. There are reports of opposition in the Army, even in the Revolutionary Command Council. I know you work under very difficult circumstances and that people are listening to what you say. Do you have any sense of this?
I don't have any sense of it. Of course, I always have the option as a journalist not to talk at all if I feel I'm under some kind of pressure. I can honestly tell you that given our limited access and given the fact that we've been wandering around Baghdad only for the last several days, I haven't seen any sign of that. And whenever we go to any neighborhoods, people come up to us freely. The Ministry of Information person we take with us always hangs back so that we get feelings from people. And everybody we've talked to or who has come up to talk to us says that they're very angry with America now. Whatever their feelings were before the war about Saddam Hussein, they feel unified because they feel their country's under attack. And they say that feelings in the future about America will not be what they've been in the past.
Okay, Bill, we're going to go to Moscow for a moment if you want to try to stick one of your cameras out the window, if it's relevant to do so, but we'd like to be able to continue talking to you. So let's go to Moscow now, and ABC's Jim Laurie, who's standing by there. It isn't very long ago that the Iraqi Foreign Minister, Jim, left Moscow to make his way back to Baghdad. So take us through the last several hours.
Yes, Peter, this afternoon, Iraqi Foreign Minister Tariq Aziz left Moscow first for Tehran after confirming that his government accepted a 6-point Soviet peace plan that includes a 21-day withdrawal period for the Iraqis to get out of Iraq. And, of course, that plan has been considered inadequate by the U.S. President Gorbachev made one final appeal to the Iraqis as Aziz left, asking them, and we quote here, to weigh the consequences of the next and last stage of the war. So one final appeal to Tariq Aziz. Meanwhile, Gorbachev's spokesman, Mr. Ignatенko, said that the president here had been engaged in a long series of telephone calls all day today with each and every member of the anti-Iraq coalition. Presumably, the purpose of this was to, in some way, salvage the Soviet plan, and at the same time urge them to use the UN Security Council to consider ways, and again we quote here, to find an integrated Iraqi withdrawal plan.
Jim, just before we go a little bit deeper into the Soviet plan and the American plan, let's listen for a moment to a little bit of what Tariq Aziz, the Iraqi foreign minister, had to say just before he left Moscow to go to Tehran, and then presumably he'll have to drive on to Baghdad.
Here tell you that the Iraqi government fully endorses this plan and fully supports it. Last night, the Revolution Command Council issued a statement saying that Iraq supports the Soviet initiative and it appreciates the Soviets' efforts to reach a peaceful settlement to the situation. And we particularly appreciate the efforts of His Excellency President Mikhail Gorbachev and his government in this regard.
Now, there are some serious differences between the Soviet plan and the American ultimatum, which President Bush laid out yesterday as he put it on behalf of the whole coalition. But in the Iraqi proposal, or in the Iraqi Soviet plan, there would be 21 days, as you've heard mentioned, for them to get out of Kuwait, as opposed to the 7 days which is contained in the U.S. Ultimatum. After withdrawal under the Soviet Iraqi plan, all the Security Council resolutions against Iraq would be null and void, and on terms of prisoners of war and exchanging prisoners of war, it all pretty much comes within the same. There's not an enormous difference between the two of them. So, Jim Laurie, I want to know if there's any feeling in Moscow whether or not there's any thought on the Soviet part that they can continue to pursue this plan, or are they resigned to the fact that it's been superseded by the American one?
I think at this point here in Moscow, there is a sense of resignation and sadness. There is some talk of continuing trying for initiatives, but the feeling here is once the ground war begins, and the presumption here is that it will very shortly, then there is very little likelihood of reviving this kind of plan. But as I did mention, the Soviets do seek to take what they have to the UN Security Council, at least for the individual consideration of the UN Security Council members.
Okay, Jim Laurie, if you wouldn't mind standing by. This reminds us so much, of course. This is a live picture from Baghdad at 7:30 in the evening. Precisely what we saw 37 days and 17 hours ago when the war began. It is not, of course, as extensive in terms of defense as we saw on that first night described by U.S. pilots as like a Christmas tree lighting up. But Bill Blakemore, in Baghdad, we can still see explosions on the ground in the distance. One wonders whether or not they haven't run out of targets. Bill Blakemore, can you hear me? Okay, Bill Blakemore can't hear me for just a second, but that is a live picture of the war continuing to be prosecuted in a very vigorous way. That's the western outskirts of Baghdad.
Yes, I am. Can you hear me?
Yes, Bill, go ahead.
Blakemore, can you hear me?
Yes, Bill, we can hear you. Go ahead.
All right. I was going to say, Peter, that this is the sort of thing we've had most nights here during this war. There were a few nights when we didn't have it leading up to that Iraqi proposal of about a week ago. I can just tell you that this bombing somewhere out there on the edges of the city started just about the time your show went on. Some of them have been very loud and have shaken the windows of the hotel a bit.
Bill, can you give us some sense of how far away it is? You're in the western side of the river there, and it's not a very built-up area. But what are the targets far out in the western perimeter there they're trying to attack?
Peter, I can't tell you what direction that's in, and I really don't even know. We just know that it's going on here in the city and out on the edges of the city. And, of course, you'd understand that we're not supposed to talk about any directions anyway.
Okay. Well, we can tell you at least fairly safely from here that it is out on the western side of the frontier, and that Bill Blakemore and the Al Rashid Hotel, where they've been hearing the bombing very close in the last several days. And that white picture that you see is the results, we've now become experienced enough to know, the results of a very large explosion out on the ground, creating that enormously intense white light from the ground. Bill, have you managed to hear Radio Baghdad tonight and some of the attitude it has taken towards the beginning of a land war?
I haven't heard it myself, but I've heard descriptions of it by people who have been listening, and it sounds like there's been a great deal of description today on Baghdad radio of what they're saying is going to be a major battle, the mother of battles kind of language that we've been hearing for some time here, and saying that the Iraqis would be victorious. We've certainly heard from many of the people in Baghdad we've been talking to this afternoon that they expect it's going to be bloody and that many people, they say, will be killed on both sides.
Okay, Bill Blakemore, thank you very much. We'll be coming back to you a little later in the hour. Radio Baghdad also said today, in terms of the land war actually beginning, if we're attacked, we shall turn the earth into hell. We shall murder you and destroy you with all your sophisticated machinery. Very much the same kind of rhetoric that the Iraqis and other Arabs have heard since the beginning of the campaign. It is difficult to know 37 days into the war, with Iraq having taken such a pounding from the air, whether or not it still invites people to stand up and defy the coalition, which has been so evidently powerful. In terms of the war today, let's go briefly and check into eastern Saudi Arabia, where Sam Donaldson is standing by. Sam, there's been any difference whatsoever today in the way the war has been prosecuted or the way you've been briefed on it?
Well, Peter, not only more of the same, but even with greater intensity. First of all, Brigadier General Richard Neal, the briefer in Riyadh about an hour and a half ago, made certain what we've been talking about from the diplomatic standpoint, and that is there is no evidence that they have from intelligence sources that the Iraqis are withdrawing. He says we see nothing on the ground to indicate that there is any Iraqi withdrawal. There have been 1,200 sorties over the Kuwaiti theater of operations in the last 24 hours, Peter, and that is compared with 1,000 the day before, which was a record, so they're setting new records. I'm told their artillery exchanges along the border have been stepped up, as you might suppose. Really, the battlefield preparation is underway. Ground war isn't underway yet, but if the president decides to order one, it could very well come in the next few hours from the standpoint of what we're ready for here.
Sam, you're a fair piece from the Kuwaiti border, but I understand that down there you are even there experiencing the effects of the oil fires up in Kuwait.
Well, as you can see, it's nighttime here, but during the day, Peter, if you go outside, you can still see the sun, but there is this grayish tinge to the sky. And you're right, we're about 240 kilometers from the border down here in the eastern part of Saudi Arabia. And up in Kuwait itself, we're told there are now about 190 oil well installations that are on fire, which is an increase from yesterday's 150. The scorched earth policy clearly is continuing, and that smoke up there is obscuring about 25% of Kuwait, making it more difficult for air to bomb.
The president, it was, who called it a scorched earth policy yesterday. Do military people there think it is an effective device by Saddam Hussein to impinge on or impede an attack?
Well, there's two things. It's a device to impinge on or impede an attack if that's possible, although our military leaders say they can come right through the smoke. But they also think that he's getting ready for the end. It's the inevitable. In addition to the scorched earth policy of setting the oil wells on fire, we're told today that mass executions are taking place in Kuwait City. This comes from Kuwaiti intelligence as well as our own U.S. intelligence sources. We're told that Iraqi troops are just picking Kuwaitis up off the street, particularly ones that they've interrogated before, and they're killing them. And the view here is they're killing them in order to dispose of the evidence.
Okay, Sam Donaldson will be coming back to you on a number of occasions in the next hour, but want to go to Washington now to continue this somewhat difficult to understand process between the United States and the Soviets and the Iraqis. Joining us is our national security correspondent, John McWethy. Have the Soviets and the Americans been speaking this morning, John, and sort of where does that all seem to sit?
It was very late last night that Secretary Baker, who is up at Camp David with President Bush, had a long phone conversation with Foreign Minister Bezhmertnik of the Soviet Union. And they apparently went over the details of what the Soviets believe they had accomplished with the Iraqis during the 2 or 3 days of intense negotiations in Moscow. And when it was all over, Baker apparently indicated to Bezhmertnik that it still sounded like there were conditions as far as the U.S. was concerned, and it just wasn't going to fly. But there is a very strong impression among some people in the U.S. government that the Soviets are continuing to try to bring the Iraqis along. There is also a feeling that although Tariq Aziz has left Moscow, that the Soviets have a very good communications link to Baghdad, and they are continuing to work this. Now, just speculatively here, Peter, although the United States says that the Iraqis must show by noon that they are beginning a withdrawal, and then it must be over completely in 7 days, if the Iraqis were to begin a withdrawal today, even without comment, even without an authoritative announcement that the U.S. wants. Some officials are speculating that even if it took them longer than the 7 days the U.S. wants, the U.S. could not go ahead with the ground war. There are still ways the Iraqis can stop this if they want to, but they have to do something other than the kind of scorched earth policy that Sam was describing.
Okay, let me just ask you a couple quick questions, John, before we go on at length about this. Does the Bush administration now think that the Soviets are making a major contribution, they're working on the same side, or that the Soviets are playing for their own goals now?
Oh, I think the feeling at the very highest levels of the U.S. government is that the Soviets are making a good faith effort, and the United States does not regard it as being an impediment. They know that the Soviets do have a slightly different agenda, but there has been no feeling that they are intriguing here for their own benefit.
Okay, let's go away for just a second and then come back and talk about the U.S. plan and the Soviet plan and whether or not perhaps the United States should be waiting a little longer before beginning the land war.
ABC News coverage continues in a moment.
This is the sound of Unisom, the sound of sleep. With Unisom, you hit your pillow and fall asleep fast. Tonight, you can